Hello and welcome back. From my previous video, I know that there are many new subscribers and viewers on the channel, but I must stress that I can't post very often to YouTube, as it takes a lot of time on my part to put together a video of sufficient quality, and I do have an 8 to 4 job working IT. Furthermore, a lot of the content on this channel is also dedicated to looking at subversions or excellent examples of either TV, films, or games. There are some videos on politics or the state of the world in general, but they are sometimes few and far between. If you'd like a bit more of that content, you can always check out my Substack, which is where the content for this video is coming from. For now, I would like to take my Legacy of Kain series from Substack and also post it here on YouTube. To that end, I'm largely going to be reading that article, as it is laid out on Substack, but adding a bit more visuals and clips from the games. Thank you all for subscribing, and with that introduction to the channel out of the way, let's dive into the Legacy of Kain universe. This collection of essays will serve to explain all within the lore behind the video game series Legacy of Kain. The game series has a rich history, and the world is incredibly well constructed alongside its story. I believe it is a good story, and one that is worth analysing and sharing with others. But be warned that there is a lot of content within this series. As such, I am prepared to split these over several essays or videos, because to amalgamate them would perhaps create a short novel in its own right. In exploring the lore within the series, I will be starting from the very beginning of the world and travelling linearly to the conclusion at the end of the final game. Rather than follow the releases of the game, I will be going chronologically through them, meaning Blood Omen, Blood Omen 2, Soul Reaver, Soul Reaver 2, and finally Legacy of Kain Defiance. These 5 titles make up the main part of the story, but I will begin before all of these games and discuss the Prehistory of Nosgoth, the lands in which these games take place, akin to how Lord of the Rings occur within Middle-earth. It is important to note that there will be heavy spoilers within, as the game exposes the player to these truths in a non-linear fashion, meaning that some of the information presented would come as revelations in later games. However, I am writing from the perspective of someone who knows the full story, and so will not hide or obscure information, but state plainly what happened and in the order that it did happen. And so without further ado, let us delve into the land of Nosgoth. In its earliest days, Nosgoth was inhabited by 3 races. The first of these were known as the Ancients.
Fairy tales, boy. The delusions of an ancient culture clinging to hope long after the world had discarded them. Their bloodline trickled away, until only one of the ancients remained, sustained solely by obligation and his unfaltering faith in the old prophecies.
The Ancients were blue-skinned winged beings of incredible grace and almost angelic beauty. Considered Nosgoth's most pure, wise, and noble civilization, the Ancients came to worship the Elder God, and exalted his doctrine, preaching their belief in his purifying cycle of birth, death, and rebirth through his Wheel of Fate.
The Wheel of Fate must turn. All are redeemed in the cleansing agony of birth, death, and rebirth. This is the engine of life, the purifying rhythm of the universe to which all souls are irresistibly drawn.
The Wheel of Fate is the inexorable cycle of birth, death, and reincarnation, to which all living creatures in Nosgoth are compelled. The wheel describes the paths that one will follow in life and will compel them to follow it. As such, it is believed that no one in Nosgoth truly possesses free will. We will speak about the Elder God and the concept of free will later on, but for now, know that the Elder God is the self-proclaimed hub of the Wheel of Fate. As devout worshippers of the Elder God, the Ancients believed in his doctrine completely. Unquestioning followers of his every word, they converted the other races of Nosgoth to worship their Elder God. The humans, second of the sapient races that existed in the earliest days of Nosgoth, also became followers of the Elder God. However, it was the race known as the Hylden and their refusal to be converted that spelled the dawn of the Dark Era within Nosgoth. The Hylden were technologically adept creatures, and though early depictions of them showed them as being humanoid and noble in appearance, most know them as having alien features, akin to that of demons. Unwilling to accept a religion they deemed wrong, Their feud quickly grew into a war that lasted a millennium. 1,000 years of battle proved equally devastating for both races. To end the conflict, both sides devised a way to finish the war once and for all. The Hylden began the creation of a device, capable of eliminating all non-Hylden life on Nosgoth. Meanwhile, the Ancients used their magical skills to tear a hole in the fabric of reality to a parallel realm known as the Demon Dimension, in order to cast their adversaries in. 9 sorcerers among the Ancients banished the Hylden to the Demon Dimension, and, to ensure they could not return, they raised the Pillars of Nosgoth to seal the passages between the two realms for as long as they stood. The Pillars of Nosgoth are the focal point of the entire Legacy of Kain fiction. It is the mythological and geographical hub of the entire series. Their appearance remains the same in each game, reaching infinitely into the sky and deep into the earth, and their well-being was inextricably tied to the spiritual and physical health of the land. From their genesis, the 9 pillars were represented by an oligarchy of immortal sorcerers, known as the Circle of 9. Each pillar and their respective guardian was assigned to one of the 9 magical principles, which comprised of metaphysical lore within Nosgoth.
This scene depicted the appointment of the original vampire guardians, each summoned to serve when the pillars were raised. Each guardian is aligned to the principle of the pillar he serves, and the balance guardian is the axis of them all.
They are as follows. Mind. Alongside its sister principle, Dimension, it was associated with the elemental force of air, which in turn was aligned with the overarching principle of light. The principle of the mind concerned sentience in Nosgoth, manifest in the mental sensitivity expressed by cognizant individuals. The mind guardians, called by the pillars, possessed unparalleled affinity for telepathy and telekinesis, and were charged with reigning over the limitless power of thought, consciousness, and emotion. Dimension. The principle of dimension concerned the distinctions between Nosgoth's material, spectral, and demonic realms. The Dimension Guardians, called by the Pillars, could perceive and shift between these planes of existence, and were charged with controlling and defining the very boundaries, consistency, and form of space itself. Conflict. Alongside its sister principle, Nature, it was associated with the elemental force of fire, which in turn was aligned with the overarching principle of light. The principle of conflict concerned the constant dichotomy between peace and war in Nosgoth. The Conflict Guardians could incite or resolve wars or arguments, drew their powers from battle, and were charged with presiding over the precepts of change and upheaval. Nature. The principle of nature concerned the growth and perpetuation of organic entities in Nosgoth. The Nature Guardians could commune with, influence, and summon natural phenomena, and were charged with governing over plants, animals, and all forms of natural life. Balance. As the hub of the magical principles of the pillars, it regulated the other principles and was associated with the elemental force of spirit. Energy. Alongside its sister principle, time, it was associated with the elemental force of earth, which in turn was aligned with the overarching principle of darkness. The principle of energy concerned the capacity for activity and exertion in Nosgoth's agents, organic and artificial alike. The Energy Guardians could use their abilities to instill power in objects and devices, and were charged with ruling over the wild arching power that spawned the storm and sparked life itself. Time. The principle of time concerned the structure of past, present, and future events and eras in Nosgoth. The Time Guardians held a certain level of omniscience due to their intimate understanding of the time stream, and were charged with keeping the flowing currents and movements of the temporal world in check. States. Alongside its sister principle, Death, it was associated with the elemental force of water, which in turn was aligned with the overarching principle of darkness. The principle of states concerned the distinctions taken on by substances within Nosgoth, such as solids, liquids, and gases. The States Guardians could defy physics, warping and transitioning between physical forms, and were charged with presiding over the shapes and forms of all physical matter. Death. The principle of death concerned the ultimate fate of souls in Nosgoth, particularly following their demise as living beings in the material realm. The Death Guardians held a measure of mastery over the afterlife and were charged with helping to ensure equivalency between life and rebirth. Using the Pillars of Nosgoth, the Ancients were able to banish the Hylden to the Demon Dimension. However, as the Hylden were being banished, they cursed their enemies with their final breath. 3 curses were laid upon the ancients. Firstly, they were made sterile, effectively making their race unable to rebuild and prosper after the war. Secondly, they were given a horrible bloodlust that, when left unsatiated, caused them excruciating agony and morphed them into horrible beasts. And finally, the curse that truly condemned the ancients as a race was the curse of immortality. The effects of this were immediate, as their elder god and wheel of fate turned their backs on them and fell completely silent. The now immortal vampires, so named because of their newfound bloodlust, having been cut off from their god, slowly went mad with anguish. Many of them committed suicide in order to return to the wheel of fate. Those that chose to carry on, immortal and godless, were governed by the original members of the circle for a time. In time, the ancient guardians also met an end, though it is unclear whether they too committed suicide as their past brethren, whether they feuded amongst each other or were hunted by the humans. However, with their deaths, the Pillars had to select new guardians, as it was magically bound to do. Since the vampires did not give birth anymore, the Pillars selected human replacements, which caused distress amongst the vampires. Knowing that the Pillars had to remain under the vampiric rule, they discovered a means of passing their curse on to humans, and the human-born guardians, creating the first true vampires. Inevitably, the human guardians began to oppose this ritual forced upon them and rebelled, thus bringing about the Sarafan era. There isn't much that can be said on the Prehistory of Nosgoth. However, I do find it interesting that the ancients' belief in reincarnation would mirror paganism, whereas the Hylden's belief in immortality would mirror Christianity. These contrasting ideas are the basis for the conflict between both races, and will be explored later on in the series.